behalf of the museum, as well as the Office of the Chancellor of Rutgers, New Brunswick. Chancellor Edwards couldn't be with us tonight, but his support for this evening's program has been important to its realization, and he does send to Dr. Painter and all of you his greetings and best wishes. This evening's lecture is a program accompanying the exhibition Melvin Edwards, 5 Decades. The show was organized by the Natural Sculpture Center in Dallas, Texas, and after its time here, it closes January 9th. It will move on to the Columbus Museum of Art in Ohio, which those of us who are Rutgers people know is the place where that other team was from on Saturday. It is funded here at the Zimmerli by the estate of Ralph Voorhees and the museum's major exhibition fund, which is a group of donors who support these important temporary exhibitions. And they are, it's a short list, James and Catherine Bergen, Alan and Joyce Glassgold, Charles and Carol Sells, the Voorhees Family Endowment, and the Jerome A. Yavetz Charitable Foundation. Additional support was provided by the Office of Institutional Diversity and Improvement here at Rutgers. This project certainly is not an exception, but no project is accomplished by just one person through one idea. And I want to point out that Donna Gustafson, curator of American art and our director of Mellon academic programs, was the curator in charge of the Edwards exhibition here at the Zimmerli, and she did a great job, has done a great job with a complicated project. Claire D'Amato, who's our education coordinator, is responsible for the smooth organization and presentation of tonight's program and the many other activities that surround the exhibition. We are grateful to both of them, as well as the many other Zimmerli staff members who have made this show and lecture possible. Now I get to introduce our wonderful speaker, then all the commercials. Dr. Nell Irvin Painter is a distinguished and award-winning scholar, writer, and teacher of American history. I'm going to do the history part, then I'll do the art part. She received her PhD from Harvard after having received her undergraduate degree from UC Berkeley. She taught at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the University of Pennsylvania, and from 1988 to 2005 at Princeton, from which she retired as the Edwards Professor Emerita of American History. Her work as a historian has explored issues of racial and gender identity and how they have figured into the history of America and the West. Her list of published scholarly works is long, as is her list of awards, residencies, and honorary degrees. I mean, really long. She is the author of numerous articles and 7 books related to the history of the American South, among them Sojourner Truth, A Life Assembled, Southern History Across the Color Line, Creating Black Americans, and The History of White People. Her most recent book, The History of White People, guides readers through more than 2,000 years of Western civilization, illuminating the invention of race as a concept and the frequent praise of whiteness. Dr. Painter will sign copies of the book at reception immediately after the lecture, and you can also have a glass of wine and talk to her. And she's wonderful. All of the above would be sufficient reason for us to invite Dr. Painter to speak tonight, but what made us determined to have her as our guest is what she's done since she retired. She went on to earn a BFA degree in painting from our own Mason Grove School of the Arts here at Rutgers in 2009, and then an MFA in painting from Rhode Island School of Design in 2011. Next page. Her work has been exhibited in shows in New York, New Jersey, and Texas, including the San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts, which probably no one in this room knows exactly where it is but me, but I've actually been there. Good, there you go. Oh, good, well, someone else, yay. I've lived in Texas a long time. As well as the Mixed Greens Gallery in Chelsea, Gallery El Faro in Newark, and several other New Jersey venues. Her artist books are in the collections of Yale University libraries and the Dana Fine Art Print Collection at the Newark Public Library. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to a Rutgers alum, Dr. Nell Irvin Painter.
Thank you for the invitation. I have known about Nell Edwards' work for some time, but it's really a pleasure to talk to you about it. This talk returns me to Voorhees Hall for the first time probably since 2009. And I was not in such a nice hall. I was an undergraduate in that big one, yeah. But I learned a lot. When I was a professor at Princeton, actually I'm a professor at Princeton again. I am now teaching again at Princeton, when I'm teaching art instead of history. I was, as Marty Mayo has said, I was a history professor, not an art historian. So everything I know about art history I learned here in Voorhees Hall. Very glad to be able to do that. So actually I learned a lot in my art education. I'm seeing some friendly faces here from Mason Groves, and I'm very glad to see them. This was a wonderful time. What I have to say to you today, I'm saying as an artist as well as a critic or a historian. Melvin Edwards has been prominent as a visual artist since the mid-1960s. He had a solo show in Santa Barbara in 1965. Also at the Walker's Art Center in Minneapolis and the Barnstall Art Center in Los Angeles. These are from the mid-1960s. In 1970, he had a solo show at the Whitney Museum of American Art. So he's been a major artist for a long time, and he's continued to exhibit his work and to inspire commentary. But in this talk, I'm going to show you a few images that are not in the show, and I assume you've all seen the show, and you all know about lynch fragments. So I'm not going to talk about lynch fragments, actually. So Melvin Edwards has always been a wide-ranging reader as well as an art maker, and his sophistication has been a blessing and a curse. For me here, there are many existing articles and interviews, so those together with my own art education, my own reading, and talking with Melvin Edwards, actually it took me through 3 different titles. So this talk no longer has the title that you saw. This talk is called Melvin Edwards in 3 titles. And that reflects the changes in my thinking over the last several months. So the talk's first title was Melvin Edwards, Materials, Process, and Change Over Time. So you're wondering what this is, right? This is called Cityscapes, Smokehouse Collective, and the artist, oh, you can see, Melvin Edwards and his longtime friend and collaborator, another senior distinguished African-American painter, abstract painter, William T. Williams, and Guy Charcha, public wall paintings in Harlem from 1969. And I'll show you 3 of those, but this will let you know what you are looking at here. My first title was Melvin Edwards, Materials, Process, Change Over Time. And the subtitle reflected what I, thinking as an artist, wanted to know about his work. So I wanted to go beyond what is usually written about him and his work, which always connects to his racial identity. So much has already been written about Melvin Edwards and his work, and Edwards has also spoken about it with great clarity. So if you look at the selected bibliography, not the whole bibliography, the selected bibliography in the Nasher Sculpture Catalog that's accompanying this exhibition here, you will find 5 double-columned pages. So most of this commentary centers on the series that Melvin Edwards entitled Lynch Fragments, and these are more than 200 small-scale welded metal wall reliefs that he produced in 3 different eras. The first, 1963 to 1967, the second from 1973 to 1974, and the third from 1978 to the present. He also makes public sculpture, and I'll show you one example of that. Now, the information on Edwards' own homepage adds, one critic noted there being the Lynch fragments, brutish power conjures the instruments used to subjugate African Americans during the centuries of slavery and oppression. So the impulse to define Edwards' work through African American history has practically been irresistible. One prominent example appears in the title of an article in the Black Scholar published in 1994 by the art historian Sharon Patton, Melvin Edwards, Sculptor of the African American Ethos. A review of Edwards' 1993 retrospective at the Neuberger Museum of Art at SUNY Purchase speaks of Edwards' firm objective to carry on the cultural values that surrounded him from birth in a black community in the state of Texas, his life, his experience coupled with the talents of his grandmother Coco, and he has named a piece after his grandmother Coco, and his exceptional parents, served as the basis for his discovery of the original source that emanates from an Africa that so defines us in America. Alex Potts, in an essay in the Nasher catalog, puts Lynch fragments at the very center of Edwards' oeuvre, linking them to Edwards' racial identity. Potts says, the foregoing of sculpture for Edwards has an intensity rooted in ongoing political struggles that have particularly affected him as an African American. Now, Edwards himself encourages that impulse through the titles that he gives his work, such as Afro Phoenix 1, Weapons of Freedom, Texas Tale, and homage to Billie Holiday and the young ones at Soweto. And he speaks freely about the relation of his work to Black life and history, especially when questioned about Lynch fragments. In 2001, he said, as a sculptor, I have the responsibility of social expression by citing problems and creating and developing solutions in form and content. This sculpture from my Lynch Fragment series is a confirmation of the creative connection between African American artists of the present, past, and future, united through art and struggle. So I could quote all night from curators, art historians, and Edwards himself on his engagement with Black history. But for me, talking about Edwards' work in terms of his racial identity was to go over well-tilled ground. The turn to racial identity was all too familiar as a trope of commentary on Black artists. I wanted to know about Edwards' materials, his process, and changes in time or in his work. These questions came from my own practice as an artist, but they're questions associated with formalist criticism. This did not sit well with Melvin Edwards. When I asked about his materials, he said they were always the same, sheet metal, period. Asked about his process, he said it was always the same, one thing, period. Asked about change over time and the way he worked, he said his work fundamentally had not changed. In 2012, he said, "My work is mature. It's not going to change much anymore." There went the first title of my talk. So the second title of my talk is the one that you saw in the Zimmerli's promotion materials, Melvin Edwards in 3 words, conceptual, formal, abstract. I knew Edwards had often defined his work as conceptual and abstract. He knows his work has always been, as he says, conceptualized. But he says first that no one can make art without conceiving it first. It means intelligence was active in order for it to be. Second, taking conceptualizing for granted, he maintains that his art has always been about improvisation. I'm improvisation, he says. Today or tomorrow, next week, I am improvising. So much for conceptual. Abstract was easier. Edwards has never pulled away from acknowledging his work as abstract. In 1968, 1970, for instance, when he, William T. Williams, and another black abstract painter, and Chiarcha painted the Smokehouse Collective public murals in Harlem, they painted abstractly. This was his conceptual abstraction, and I'm going to show you 3 images of the Smokehouse murals. Williams and Edwards, both black abstract painters, wanted to experiment with abstraction through color geometry to change an environment. As the critic Lowry Stokes Sims phrased it, they believed that a particular use of color and form could have relevance in expressing the basis of the aesthetic sense of African American people. Edwards said, if the social aspects of life and the artistic ones aren't the same thing, then they are at least metaphors for one another. In other words, if you make things aesthetically better, you improve life in some way. Hello, Melvin Edwards. Welcome to New Jersey. Edwards energetically rejects formalist criticism associated with the 20th century critic Clement Greenberg. Edwards sees formalism as severing artwork from its social and historical context. Formalism, he reckons, deprives art of its larger meaning in terms of the artist's personal history and the history of its society, both essential to Edwards' definition of his work. Formalism further decreed what counted as art and what did not count as art. However, Edwards could see early on, as he has said, all of the history of art showed that one could make art out of and about anything. Formalism, therefore, served to cramp art rather than acknowledge its range or deepen its meaning. The word formal, then, led me to a virtual dead end. As an artist engaged in social commentary, Edwards has shied away from too narrow, sustained an investigation into the materials, composition, colors, and styles of his work, as though such an investigation diminishes his work's fundamental meaning, which is historical and social. And art critic and friend Lydie Diakité characterized him in words likely to accord with his self-concept. She said, Edwards has put in place an aesthetic language that denounces oppression and discrimination and celebrates liberty, respect, and fraternity. Edwards' public artworks are points of reference which revive our memories, give us strength, and remind us that social change is possible. It remains an everyday commitment. So let us pause here to celebrate that crucial dimension of Melvin Edwards' art, its encouragement of positive social change. There is more. Melvin Edwards has been a great friend to American artists like William T. Williams, Sam Gilliam, and Jack Whitten, all abstract artists. His friendship, his comradeship as an artist has also long been international. One theme Edwards has pursued for decades is the role of Africa in his life and work. This is the subject I want to pursue. From the very beginning of his career as an artist, Melvin Edwards has been an avid reader, with the left-wing internationalist black journal Freedom Ways among his favorites from the time he was living in Los Angeles in the 1960s. He has traveled often to Africa since his first trip in 1970 and has given African-inflected titles to his work, which remains abstract. For instance, Dancing in Nigeria. And this is plate 55 in Melvin Edwards' 5 decades. In his concern with the idea and the place and people of Africa, Edwards is not unique as an African-American artist, even though his work, his abstraction, is unique. The question of the relationship of Black American artists to African art goes back to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, and notably to the philosopher Alain Locke, the visual artist Aaron Douglas, and the art historian and painter James A. Porter. I have dealt with these issues in my own artist books, Volume 27 and Volume 28 of Art History by Nell Painter, 2013-14 and 2015. Edwards, too, has spoken about Black art history in related terms. A little Harlem Renaissance history here, all too generalized, but I hope useful. In the 1920s, the great migration of Black people out of the South and the first significant flowering of Black artists, writers, and intellectuals coincided with a growing interest in sculpture from Africa. Alain Locke, writing in The New Negro in 1925, recommended African art to the Negro artist as the ancestral arts, which would endow the Negro artist with a respectable artistic pedigree. In his influential article in The New Negro, entitled The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, Locke posited a vital connection between this new artistic respect for African idiom and the natural ambition of Negro artists for a racial idiom in their art expression. Locke suggested the possibility that the sensitive artistic mind of the American Negro, stimulated by a cultural pride and interest, will receive from African art a profound and galvanizing influence. So, for Locke, writing in 1925, African art would exert a steadying influence with its discipline and its technical mastery on the Negro artist. Now, the artist who took this most to heart in the 1920s was young Aaron Douglas, who made a series of magazine covers for The Crisis and Opportunities. These were the organs of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Urban League. Douglas's work was seen as inspired by ancient Egyptian forms. And this is Alain Locke's bookplate, which Douglas designed. Douglas continued working in stylized, quote-unquote, African forms, making him the best known and most reproduced artist of the Harlem Renaissance. However, praise for Douglas was not universal. James A. Porter, the Dean of Black Art Historians and Locke's colleague at Howard University, criticized both Locke and Douglas in Modern Negro Art of 1943, which is the first scientific African-American art history, Modern Negro Art, 1943. Porter dismissed Douglas's work as flat and arid and decorative, dismembering a traditional art for the sake of rearranging motifs thus plundered. But the one that really stung was decorative. Porter took issue with Locke's advice to black artists to heed African ancestral arts. Porter reasoning that attaching themselves to African art would segregate black artists from the American art world in which they actually live, without making their art any more acceptable to white people. Between Locke, Douglas, and Porter is where Africa stayed for black American artists until about the 1960s. Africa remained an abstraction for black Americans until the 1960s, when independence made possible travel to countries that had remained off limits while they were colonies. And my parents and I spent 2 years in Ghana in the mid-1960s, residence that changed my life. Melvin Edwards first traveled to Africa in 1970 as the Whitney Museum of Art was mounting an exhibition of his work. The trip changed his life also, inaugurating a continuing engagement. Actually meeting African artists in Africa was important to Edwards as a reconnection with the land he called home. He says his family in Texas never doubted that they were African. In a sense, that is what African Americans are. These are Melvin Edwards' words. We use the word Negro, but all in all, it means the word African. Our community was African, and it was all the varieties of Africa you could think of. There were people who looked like they never left the continent, and some were very fair. Everyone's family had some type of African, mixed all types of ways. You have the concept in your head and your spirit somewhere, but you don't have the detailed structure. It's too many generations ago. But the concept related to it, that's there somewhere in Africa. So that's Melvin Edwards. A tangible connection to African culture is important to Edwards' art. Early on, before he began traveling to the continent, he sought that connection to home through black music, specifically jazz. Jazz musicians, especially John Coltrane and Ornette Coleman, improvised in a manner that stimulated his creativity. He said, "Music gave me another language. I would have to make aesthetic advances on a par with those made by African American jazz musicians. When I was in the room with my friends listening to our music, I had a black creative environment. When you went out to visit museums, you could not find that." Edwards told me the connection to Africa through jazz music helped bridge the gap between Africa and Black America in visual art. African musical influences, notably complex rhythms and improvisation, had continued over the centuries in the United States, if only in attenuated forms. That lineage did exist. But fine art, especially abstract art in the US, had mostly European antecedents. This changed for Edwards after 1970, when he began experiencing African art and culture directly. Edwards and his late wife Jane Cortez continued to return to different African countries, especially Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal. The concept of African art solidified in the persons of particular artist colleagues, notably in Nigeria, artist and architect Damas Uwoko, in Kumasi, Ghana, Nana Ose Bonsu, who was the chief carver for the Asantehene, and in Senegal, the painters Suleiman Keita, who died in 2014, and Papa Ibra Tal, who runs the Manufacture Sénégalaise des Arts Décoratifs, the National Tapestry Factory ATS, and the metal artist Youssef Ndiaye, director of Frère Ndiaye Metal Fabricators. In these artists, Edwards found permanent friends and congenial collaborators. Edwards and Cortez first visited the Diaz Tapestry Factory in 1981. They bought a house in Dakar, and in 1997, they stopped in Senegal to visit Suleiman Keita on their way to Ghana. Edwards and Cortez accepted Keita's invitation to join a communal farm project, and by 2000, they had a house and a studio in the village of Mermoz, about 30 miles north of Dakar. Edwards bought a welding machine and collaborated with Youssouf Ndiaye, director of Frère Ndiaye Metal Fabricators. Edwards now spends several months per year in Senegal. He also lives in New York City, keeps his longtime studio in Plainfield, New Jersey, and a house in a hamlet in Ulster County, New York. I asked Edwards if living and working in Senegal brought respite from the incessant racial crises of the United States, if his African counterparts were perhaps easier colleagues without the thorny American racial entanglements. Edwards said no. He nearly always said no to my queries. But he likes the African-European syncretism of Manufacture Sénégalaise des Arts Décoratifs, especially, and in a new phase of his art, he is designing tapestries. A third tapestry in process this year is based on a collage painting he made of Jane Cortez in 1974. Edwards began his career as an artist and a painter, and he continued to draw and sketch while making his life's work as a sculptor. Was tapestry, I ask, an example of late style, when a mature artist sets out in a new direction or returns to an early love? Once again, he told me no. In 2012, Manthia Diawara and Lydie Dikate had asked him whether living in Senegal would influence his art. He said much the same thing to them. My work is mature, it's not going to change much anymore. What I find and what I have found from the beginning are more confirmation of the influences and collaborations. The ideas that I've had, they do make African sense. Okay, Melvin Edwards' work is mature. But if you ask me, and you did, it continues to change. He has made lynch fragments, murals, public sculpture, some brightly colored to wide acclaim. But tapestry, a collaborative art that he designs with extraordinary exuberant color, does, I think, represent something new in the art of this American master. Thank you.